Dear members and guests, I'd like to thank President Greenberg for the honor of moderating this special Founders Panel. President Greenberg has selected 5 past presidents to review the 5 decades of the Association for Academic Surgery on its 50th anniversary. I would like to say that I love the AAS with all my heart and attended my first meeting in 1983 with my mentor, Dr. Dana K. Anderson, who was also a past president. The meeting is designed for young surgeons who want to succeed in academic surgery. If you attend this meeting, you will be inspired and learn the secrets of becoming a professor of surgery. This morning, the 5 past presidents, who are all world-class scholars in surgery, will share their sage perspectives of the years surrounding their presidency. In doing so, it is hoped that you will be transported along a continuum of time over the past 50 years and learn the reason why the mentoring spirit of the AAS has spread all over the world. Our first speaker is Dr. Polk, who's a legend in surgery and a founder of the AAS. Dr. Polk.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I want to give a short talk about what 1975 was like 100 years ago, and then talk a little bit about some things that are far more serious. Is that a first slide on, or can I see it? Yes. You know, every era is dominated by some things in public life, and you can imagine, you could say this was the year of The Godfather and Jaws. When something different, you can always turn to sport. And you can even look at the bottom there and say Margaret Thatcher is one of the first world leaders from the female gender. So that's the time and era in which I was fortunate enough to be president of this. And you end up with bad things like this. And this is obviously Patricia Hearst, Patty Hearst kidnapping, and Jimmy Hoffa, where they're still looking for in the Meadowlands of New Jersey. So things like that happen. But what's perhaps, I think, more troublesome is this. There are 4 bad things happened in the history of this country. One was the declaration of the war between the states. The second was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The third was this, the fall of Saigon, which is continued to mark our lives today and will for a long time to come. And then, of course, 9/11 gets in that group as a whole. So that gets you across an era. That was going on in 1975. The much better story about this is the way things really happened. George Zinner was the founder and mentor and obstetrician for this organization. The American College of Surgeons was meeting in San Francisco, and Dr. Warren, Dean Warren, the only boss I ever had, said, "Son, you ought to go to this meeting. George Zinner wants to start something, and you don't know him, but you go shake his hand and be there." And there were a room of 7 or 8 people in a undistinguished room in the San Francisco Convention Center, and Dr. Zinner laid out the plans with incredible clairvoyance of what was going to happen. I think the most dominant thing is the success of this meeting, in which 2 groups stopped competing with one another with tidy little things and began to work together. George's idea at this was to start a new society that would be inclusive. That was 40 years before the inclusive wave became what it is today, with just literally thousands of people in a large group. The exclusive groups have gone the other way, as you well know. George not only had that idea, but he was necessary because this was an outlaw kind of group, and he was forced to serve as president for the first 2 terms. Of course, the other part of what he did then, there was no publication book. There was a little book very much like the Surgical Forum, about 4 by 6 and about 400 pages thick with an abstract on every page. That was the output, first 2 professional outputs for the Association for Academic Surgery. The other thing that he did during this time was he recognized that JSR was struggling, and it still does today to some extent, but he put it on a sound basis by moving the prime papers from AAS into the Journal of Surgical Research for a long time. This is the kind of person we owe our indebtedness to considerably. George ended up his career, as most of you know, he's a professor at Hopkins, and I think was never forgiven by some of the old guard as not having trained there. How could you be chair there without having trained there? But he did so, and then he had a distinguished career back home at the University of Michigan. but he was the founder of this association. He set the principles of inclusiveness. He found us a journal with which to be associated with for a long time, and he set the stage for what you're doing today. The next most important person, actually someone I'm also very close to, I had two students in my lab summer 25 years ago. Perrin Cobb was one who built this into what it is, a combined group, and paid a price for it, but he was welcome to do that. The other was a nice boy, happened to marry my daughter, so I think I won on all fronts. Thank you for your attention.
Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Zinner, who I first met when I was a junior resident at Downstate. In 1989, I became his first recruit in academic surgery, a decision he regrets to this very day. He served as chairman for a total of 28 years and is one of the great academic surgeons. Dr. Zinner.
Thank you, Chuck. Thank you very much, Chuck, and it's really a pleasure to speak today. And as Chuck asked me, what he wanted to do was get reflections of the 1980s, which is the time I was president. Well, for one thing, I've just recently moved from Boston, in case you don't know, and for those of you living in the Northeast, the National Weather Service has announced a winter storm warning tomorrow, and I've moved to Miami, so maybe they're linked. Let me just tell you and key up a little bit of what was just said about Dr. Zeidema, who I had the privilege of being the resident under for since 1970. It was 71 to 1980. George was a quiet man. He took over as chief at Hopkins at the age of 36, not having been there, not from Hopkins, and as was just said, he was not very much appreciated. He followed Dr. Alfred Blaylock, a hugely charismatic guy, and Dr. David Sabiston, who was supposed to be the new chairman. So in the forming of the AAS, it sort of followed in George's footsteps. He wanted an open organization, non-exclusive as opposed to the other organizations that were exclusive, representing young academic surgeons, and including officers that could be elected from the floor of the meeting, which I had the opportunity to be elected from the floor. Very different from the other parts of the organization, and clearly it's grown enormously. Here's the first generation of leaders in the AAS, and almost all of them, if you see, 10 of the 12 were chairmen at the time they were formed, the organization was formed. The organization was in a hierarchy, and if you look at that hierarchy, there's the AAS down at the bottom. We were the Cub Scouts, no question about it. We were the Cub Scouts. We were those sort of scratching our way up through the hierarchy in the other organizations. But if you looked at the next generation, the 1980s, all of us were in our or early 40s. None of us were in a leadership position nationally, but 6 of the 10 in that group went on to be chairs of departments of surgery. And so there's an optimism associated with the AAS that's very hard to disregard and very important for the organization. So let me just talk a little bit about what was going on in that era. So to step back, take a big picture look at 30,000 feet, if we look at how research was evolving from the 18th century of astronomy, 19th century chemistry, 20th century of physics and life sciences, surgical research was also beginning to change. And if you looked at what we did in the 70s and the early 80s, it was a lot of physiology. And it was transitioning research around us going into the genomics and molecular biology area. But surgical research wasn't really catching up. So here's an article from the Annals in 1986 that comes from the surgery branch of the NCI, and the title is Disappointing Report. So if you look at the details, basically what it said is during the 1980s, the early 80s, research from NIH was increasing in departments of medicine and decreasing in departments of surgery. In response to that, the American College of Surgeons in 1986, under the leadership of William Longmire, who was chair emeritus at UCLA, formed the Conjoined Council on Surgical Research because of these responses. And I won't go through all of the recommendations, but it helped recatalyze what research needs to be in surgery and in departments of surgery. For example, 1 year is not enough to train someone to do surgical research. 2, surgeons need to get involved with NIH on the study sections and submit many more grants. And so the Conjoint Council really did help restart interest in surgical research, set some guidelines, and published its yearly in the Bulletin of the American College of Surgeons, what of scholarships and research grants were available to surgeons in training. I had the privilege of editing that on a yearly basis for the college, and I can tell you that it really did help a lot of departments get started. All right, but let me talk about the 1980s, and in my view, 3 paradigm-changing events in the 1980s that I think you all relate to. One was the prelude to the changes in duty hours that led to culture change for us. 2, the introduction of disruptive technology. 3, the acceptance of diversity that changed surgical culture. Let's take the first one, duty hours, culture change. In 1984, Libby Zion was admitted to New York Hospital, an 18-year-old woman suffering from depression on MAO inhibitors, developed agitation, was treated with Demerol, and resulted in a drug-drug interaction and her death. Her father was a powerful and wealthy attorney who had formerly worked for the New York Times, and he decided to go on a hunt for the solution to this problem, which he felt killed his daughter. And in fact, what resulted from that was a series of articles, a series of laws that were changed, and we became the Libby Zion case that ultimately changed what we currently live with, which are the ACGME regulations on the 80-hour work week. That was a huge change that occurred in the 1980s. We are still, this is Dr. Bill Moria's article from this fall, still, if you will, litigating the issues of those kinds of changes that we all live with today. In fact, I'll contend that it not only led to the changes in the 80-hour work week, but it was the beginning in surgery for the quality and safety culture that we also live with today. One of the 3 paradigm-changing events of the 1980s. The second was disruptive technology, the laparoscope. Here we are, 1980s, you know, the gynecologist had used it in the 1970s, but to a very limited degree. 1985 was the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy in Erlangen, Germany. The first one that was video-assisted was Moret in Lyon, France. And the first one in the United States was 1988 by Barry McKinnon in Marietta, Georgia. And I remember at UCLA in 1989 was the first one we did when we invited Dr. Paraset, again from France, to help assist us. Clearly a paradigm change for the way we define surgery and what is surgery today. The third one is diversity and women in the profession. In my career, this has been an arc of this change that's occurred in this culture. I started as an intern in 1981. There was 1 woman in a class of 22 interns. I finished my super chief year in 1980 at Hopkins. There were no women who had ever finished the program at Hopkins. It wasn't until 2003, in fact, that the first woman professor came to Johns Hopkins. And in 1988, I became the chairman of the department at UCLA. And whether it happened serendipitously by the match or on purpose, 5 of the 6 interns that year were women. Now, having said that, I will also tell you that the faculty at UCLA were going to kill me because this was really a radical change from what had gone on. But these were the women who were my trainees at the time in 1990, and they've gone on to very successful roles. Deans, chairman of chapters of the ACS, program directors, chairmen of chiefs of divisions, and they've all done spectacularly well. All right, so let me take a slight digression here. And this is for some who know me. I've worked in the kitchen as a line chef for many famous chefs around the country. Some of you know this, some of you don't. It's a little bit of a hobby. And so I've worked with Thomas Keller, for example, in the French Laundry, Danielle Ballou from Ballou and Danielle's. I've worked with Eric Repair from Le Bernardin, and in fact, even made the front page of the dining out section of the New York Times. I even have 2 restaurants in Boston that I own. And the reason to take this diversion is I've made lots of observations about a comparison between what we do in our profession in surgery and what a formal French kitchen looks like. The hierarchy, the sharp instruments, long hours, mise en place, everything in place. And the last one, the challenge for women to succeed in the profession. So I'm going to digress a second to my favorite cartoon. And for those of you who have children or grandchildren, you'll remember Ratatouille. And that's the story of a kitchen, a formal French kitchen, and women in the profession.
Listen, I just want you to know how honored I am to be studying under such a...
No, you listen. I just want you to know exactly who you are dealing with. How many women do you see in this kitchen?
Well,
Only me. Why do you think that is?
Well,
Because haute cuisine is an antiquated hierarchy built upon rules written by stupid old men. Rules designed to make it impossible for women to enter this world. But still I'm here. How did this happen?
because you,
Because I am the toughest cook in this kitchen. I have worked too hard for too long to get here, and I am not going to jeopardize it for some garbage boy who got lucky. Got it?
Yo! Wow!
Sound familiar? So, and finally, let me give some advice from me, a senior member of the association. Some keys to success in academic surgery. And for that, I resort to an old philosopher, Woody Allen. 80% of success is showing up. And I end with a great scene from Annie Hall.
This guy goes to a psychiatrist and says, Doc, my brother's crazy. He thinks he's a chicken. And the doctor says, well, why don't you turn him in? And the guy says, I would, but I need the eggs.
We need the eggs. So with that, I end and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zinner. In every one of our generations, there comes along a mind that's so brilliant, it's like looking into the sun. For our generation, that's Dr. David Soybel. He and I met when we were residents going to the different meetings. He was from Washington University in the lab there, and I was from downstate. And we would meet up at all the meetings. And I must confess that to this day, I still don't understand any of his research. Dr. Soybel.
Oh, well, it is really hard to follow Dr. Zinner. I actually wanted to start out by thanking Caprice for inviting me. I'm so honored, and I have such a warm place in my heart for Caprice and for Jake and their family. And I want to tell a story that tells you what a brilliant mentor and perceptive person I am. My wife will recognize this. We were in the recovery room, and I saw Jake and Caprice kind of, friendly talking to each other. And I said to Jake, guys, you really look like you're very comfortable. I think you should ask her out. I know she's chief resident and everything, but, And so Jake said, okay, I'll think about that. And then 2 days later, Caprice came up to me and said, Jake did not have the heart to tell you we've been seeing each other for 8 months. So with that disclaimer as to being the brilliant guy, I wanted to start out this talk talking about the 1990s, which, and really every decade, of course, has it's a prelude to the future, and it's easy to look back and see those seeds. But the 90s took off on some of the disruptive things that Mike talked about, and it was a very disruptive decade. I show this picture from the Hubble telescope, which launched the decade. It was launched in 1990, and unbelievable pictures came back from this. And of course, this is known as the pillars of creation because this is where stars are born. There may be a little bit of an analogy to the AAS, but I won't push it. I'm sorry, where's the clicker? Oh, there we go. And what I want to start off with is giving a little bit of perspective, perhaps a little more formal. Throughout the 1990s, we saw some truly major events. They were bookended by George H.W. Bush being president at the beginning and George W. Bush at the end and Bill Clinton in the middle. And a lot happened. Many people may remember this. Some of the younger members may have just been growing up. But two important things happened in the news cycle. If we just look at our own domestic news cycle. First, the news cycle became a word. We talked about news cycles in terms of 24 hours, and up until then, the news was something you saw for half an hour or an hour in the evening, but not in the 1990s. Suddenly, all news was dominant on a 24-hour cycle. Two other really interesting things happened in the late 1990s, which I think are very important. First, at the very same time, Fox News and MSNBC were founded. And shortly after that, Jon Stewart came on to give us all perspective. This is the beginning of the partisan politics and the division that you see in the way people look at things. But at the same time, and one of the things that made this possible is what happened in technology in the 1990s. It's reflecting back 25 years, it's hard to believe that in one decade, just about everything that we do with technology was initiated or thought about in the 1990s. The internet was founded in 1991, or renamed as such, the World Wide Web. Memory cards, webcams. Sony PlayStation came in the mid-1990s. Google was founded in 1996. The first Bluetooth phones came in 2000, the year that I was president, and the first camera phones. And the perspective on this is that media started picking up on technology as the story itself. So Wired magazine was founded in 1993. Clay Christensen from Harvard Business School coined the term disruptive innovation. IBM's Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov, a master in chess, and we all believed that Y2K was going to be a problem. It stretched our credulity and made us all very nervous. In popular music, there was a schizophrenia. On the one hand, you had tunes by Mariah Carey and U2 and Britney Spears. These were all in the top charts, but there was an undercurrent of social unrest and concern. Pearl Jam having a song about teen suicide and killing in the name, about injustice. Bruce Springsteen singing about poverty, and Michael Jackson about violence, etc. Stevie Wonder. Along with that, in popular movies, there was a similar schizophrenia evolving. On the one hand, the most popular films were things like Jurassic Park and Terminator and Titanic, which were amazing technology feats. And underneath, there was a culture war going on. Thelma and Louise came out and made the cover of Time magazine. There was a conversation in the movie Philadelphia about AIDS and bias against gays. And movies like Fargo and Pulp Fiction came out, which really challenged what we were thinking in terms of what was acceptable. And then, of course, Saving Private Ryan came out and asked us to think about veterans again. While all this is going on, molecular biology, which had just started in the mid-1980s, with P53 being identified as a major tumor suppressor, all of a sudden, molecular biology became something that you could do in a kit. It's time-consuming, but there it was. And so the first therapeutic gene transfer was initiated in 1990 at NIH. The FDA approved the first genetically engineered blood clotting factors. And all of this expansion and pushing of the envelope led to something we're going to hear about later in the meeting, which was the death of a patient, Jesse Geisinger. Now, what was happening in surgery was a lot of different forces acting on us. First of all, there was technology. Mike alluded to minimally invasiveness, but there was also the assembly of large data sets that did not exist before then. Mike taught us at the Brigham about business and the fact that it found it could not afford the price tag of healthcare anymore. And we had the public eye on error, first culminating in the Bell Commission that started in 1989, restricting work hours in New York, and then Atul Gawande's essays on error, and it became very personal to people. And then the IOM published in 1999, To Err is Human. And meantime, demographically, things are changing in surgery. Mike alluded to the increasing presence of women in the profession. And the other thing is the term Generation X was coined, or the modern definition of Generation X was coined in the 1990s, and suddenly there were us boomers, and there were the traditionalists, and there were the Gen Xers, and now we see this generational change. This was alluded to yesterday in the meeting. In academic surgery, a lot was going on. In research at the bench, suddenly there was this whole idea about team science and systems biology. For the first time since the founding of NIH, the modern NIH, funding was oscillating quite a bit. At the beginning of the decade, we were down below the 10th percentile. By the end of the decade, we were heading down again. In education and credentialing, there was a huge expansion of faculties and expansion of residencies. There was e-simulation starting, that hadn't existed before, and there was an inversion in training because now the easiest cases like gallbladders and hernias, things on which interns cut their teeth, were now the most difficult ones. And the research and outcomes in health services suddenly became a field. The NSQIP was initiated in 1993 by Shukri Khoury, and then John Berkmeyer published his first papers with Gil Welch, and Atul Gawande and Troy Brennan published their papers looking at huge data sets and trying to figure out how we could do better care. And during the 1990s, surgeons started getting MBAs, academic surgeon leaders were chosen for business background, and trainees began choosing that pathway. So what was happening with the AAS? Well, we were growing in membership, but not as much as has happened in the last 2 decades. Our attendance was basically static, and people were looking for different alternatives to enhancing their careers. But there was an increase in diversity, and there was an expanded resident and number of young faculty awards. In 1991, Dana Anderson started the first Fundamentals of Research course held at the University of Chicago. And over the next several years, that program solidified, and a lot of people in this room took that course. By the end of the decade, in 1998, the year that I was program chair, Outcomes in Health Services would add it to the program for the first time. There were 11 submissions in that very first offering. And none of them were considered good enough to be on the program. Look at what this meeting is now. We initiated in 1999 a committee on technology and communication, which has now burgeoned into what we see today with 2 or 3 committees covering this problem. And in 2000, the Joel Roslin Faculty Research Award was named. I want to take a minute just for a second to talk about Joel, because I think we all feel his influence today. Of course, we hear about the award, but Joel was president in 1992, and he was always there encouraging people and just being just a wonderful friend and just all this positive energy. And when he died in the late 1990s, it was the Journal of Surgical Research that ended up with Chip Shoba and David McFadden putting together the Joel Roslin Faculty Research Award that we have today. I just want to take a minute to review what I think are the key messages from the AAS presidents of the 1990s. They resonate, even though we're seeing the presidents of the last several years reformulating many of these ideas and adding their own. But I think that many of these ideas are relevant and timeless. When Neil Garrison spoke in 1991 in Colorado, he tried to remind us that the AAS members are stewards of the future. When Joel spoke from his heart, he told us, okay, check with reality, but please hold on to your ideals. Don't let this other stuff knock you down. Karen Geis gave a very powerful address, well worth reading, on power. And it was the year that Bill Clinton had been elected, and there was we thought we were going to get Hillary Clinton to speak. She declined. But Karen went on and gave us a wonderful talk about we have the power to do good and we're not powerless. And Chip Shoba, a very wise and deep thinker, talked about getting things done and how it needs teamwork and resilience, topics that resonate today. David Dunn talked about the academic health centers, and he was probably the first person who said we need to get over ourselves, roll up our sleeves, and get out there and engage. And Dave McFadden reminded us that our foremost mission was to help patients get well. Bob Conter talked about looking beyond the triple threat. He was one of the first people to say you don't need to be a triple threat. A department needs to be a triple threat. And Chuck, who was always the engaged guy, said, forget about all this stuff. What's the most interesting problem you want to solve? Suzanne Klimberg gave us a really powerful address on being grateful, an attitude of gratitude. And I just tried to talk about how learning to be a surgeon means becoming a better person. So I just want to take another minute to talk about 1998. That was the year Chuck was the president. And there were a lot of there was a movie that came out in 1988. I hope some of you know this movie called The Big Lebowski. And it was uncanny how so many of the quotes in that movie were like our council meetings. Now, for example, Dave Dunn specifically said, new technology permits us to do very exciting things. Suzanne Klimberd looked at the rest of the council and said, please don't be fatuous. Zentelman and Berger said, we don't roll on Shabbos. And Dave McFadden said, you know, sometimes you eat the bear and sometimes the bear eats you. And there was Chuck saying, the AAS will abide. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Our next speaker, Dr. Herb Chen, is an absolutely brilliant surgeon scientist. I have learned so much from watching him give his scientific presentations. It's actually influenced the research in my own lab. Within 12 years of his finishing training, he rocketed to become a new young chair in America, which makes him the envy of almost no one in this room. Dr. Chen.
Good morning, everyone. Whoa. So we had an incredible decade between 2000 and 2010 in the AAS. And I think really when I joined the AAS in 2000, people thought of the AAS perhaps like this. But over the 10 years, I think the AAS transformed to be thought of more like this. And I'll explain this in a second. Because when I joined the AAS, and I remember distinctly people saying this to me when I was going to my first meeting as a faculty member, you know, the AAS is an organization of rat doctors. Why would you possibly want to participate in that organization? And this was the prevalent thought from many people at the time. But I think remarkably over this decade, we became more than rat doctors, is that we reached out, we included people doing health services research, educators, and I think really has become what I think is the most inclusive organization that we have. So I'd like to refer to our decade as really the decade of inclusiveness, perhaps a message that we need to emphasize more than ever today. So by doing that, we reached out. We have a lot of partnerships and outreach, and this lists all our different partner societies that the AAS now works with to advocate for all academic surgeons. And I think perhaps the most important relationship that developed during the decade is the partnership with our sister organization, the Society of University Surgeons. And really what created, as you all can see today, what was created in our decade was the Academic Surgical Congress. And to walk you a little back in history of how that happened a little bit, and now obviously we're here at our 12th annual Academic Surgical Congress, something that in our decade we never dreamed that really this would be here. And going back to Siobhan Corbett's initial president's message in her newsletter where she announces and describes a little bit about the process that'll happen, which involved the presidents in our decade just working out the logistics with the Society of University Surgeons and how this would happen. And everyone was worried, well, will this work? Will people come? Will this be a flop? Do we take this risk to make perhaps both organizations stronger? And I had the good fortune at that time to be the AAS recorder working with my partner on the SUS side, Kim Kirkwood, as the SUS Publications Chair as we put together the first Academic Surgical Congress program. And the thought was that, well, if we got lucky, maybe we'd get the same amount of people attending, maybe a little more. But you can see on the left column when we describe what actually happened in the meeting, we had more people, we had more abstracts than just the sum of our two meetings. And then we had more people attend than just the sum of the AAS and SUS. So really, just incredible. Now you look at the numbers, we had almost 500 abstracts and almost 800 attendees, which really, we were so excited at the time and never dreamed that it would be the amounts that we see today of 1,400 abstracts and over 2,000 attendees. Also during our decade, we decided that we had to do more for our membership and more to help them progress. And as mentioned, that we initially had this very successful Fundamentals of Surgical Research course that Dr. Anderson set up, but we realized we have to do more, so we initiated the Career Development course, which is now also in its 12th year, which really works to help our members advance in their career, advance in promotion, and really help them navigate the perhaps difficult waters of academic surgery. We also decided that the AAS wasn't going to be an organization bound by walls, that we were going to go beyond just the United States, and we were going to really be an international society. And to do that, we also realized that we had to send our members and provide the opportunities for us to go abroad. And so during our decade, we initiated the traveling grants and visiting professorships, as shown here, going to Taiwan, Australasia, and a lot of different places. And we also decided we had to take our course abroad. So we started to teach the very first Fundamentals of Surgical Research course outside the United States in Africa in 2008, followed by a course in Australia in 2009. And I do want to credit Richard Henney, who is usually at this meeting but couldn't make it this year, for his continued being a great ally of the AAS to continue on with developing a career and skills in academic surgery course, or the DCAS course, which has become immensely successful, and you can see it's just coming up in a couple of months. We also made significant strides in diversity during our decades, and I'm so honored to be up here at the podium representing my fellow presidents during this decade. And you can see that a very talented group of surgeons, and I tried to find the most up-to-date pictures of everyone too, but two of them haven't changed at all since that decade. But really, great strides in diversity. The first two and only two African-American presidents occurred in our decade, as well as two Asian leaders as well. And so lastly, I think we started to think about what the future of the AAS was going to be, and made some important decisions that we were going to start the AAS Foundation to ensure that financially the AAS could continue to do all the good work that it does in the future. And I'm very honored to be part of the AAS Foundation on the board, and to announce that we have a new initiative under the leadership of our president, Lillian S. Is that probably as academic surgeons, we have the great fortune to be invited to be visiting professors, to give lectures where we receive an honorarium. So my challenge to you all in the audience is, if you are one of those people, to consider donating one honorarium to the AAS Foundation. And so you're going to get information from the foundation on how you can do that quite easily, and maybe even consider doing that more than once. And so I'll put out as an initial challenge to my past presidents, both on the stage and the audience and the leaders in the AAS, that I will start this process off by pledging $10,000 of my honorariums to the AAS Foundation. And I hope that many of you will follow suit. And lastly, the AAS is all about the young people. And so during our decade, we also made it possible for both medical students and residents to take part in the AAS and participate in our committees. And so for you students and residents in the audience who are not members of the AAS, I invite you all to join today and help us continue to advocate for, as you can see on this slide, to inspire and develop young academic surgeons. I think that we had a fabulous decade, but I know that the AAS will have even better decades in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Our last speaker of this morning is a remarkable leader. Only 3% of the professors of surgery are women, and it's the current generation that are going to change that. And one of the great leaders in this diversity transformation is our next speaker, Dr. Lillian S. She not only was she a fantastic past president, she now serves as the president for the AAS Foundation, which will help ensure the legacy of the AAS. She also taught us that it was the use of social network was actually an innovative way of education in surgery. Dr. Cow?
I am proud to represent the presidents from 2011 to present, and I'm truly privileged to have served with such outstanding leaders. I would first like to say that if we, the AAS, have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants, and that our decade would not be able to have accomplished all that we have and are going to do without the leaders who preceded us. And I think that you'll see that the themes of this decade are really echoing those that were started by the past presidents here and out in the audience. I would also like to say that the AAS could not accomplish everything that it does without its amazing executive councils, committees, and the membership, all of you. So as a society of young academic surgeons, I would say that for the AAS, the sky is limitless. I think that as young leaders, we wish to tell everybody, and we embrace as our leadership and amongst our membership, thinking outside of the box. And in order to gaze upward, we needed to look inward this decade, reach outward, and press forward. So we've seen this logo throughout this presentation, but in actuality, this logo did not exist until 2011. So under President Dan Elbow and with Recorder Melina Kibbe, we decided to rebrand the AAS. And so this logo actually represents open doors because the AAS opens doors for current and future academic surgeons. And even the color of the AAS logo is meant to be warm, inviting, and vibrant. After Dan Elbow, the successive presidents have thought long and hard to really explicitly define what is the mission of the AAS and its values. And although it's obvious through the presentations, we felt that we really wanted to have a strategic plan that transcended each individual president. So in 2014, Tim Polk led a facilitated retreat, and we decided that our explicit mission of the AAS is inspiring and developing young academic surgeons. And I think we can see that all of the AAS's initiatives really embrace this concept. Pictured here is the AAS Fall Courses, which you heard was started by past presidents, expanded to include the career development courses. And today we enjoy a robust attendance and as well as multiple international courses. In fact, we now actually have had to institute an international courses task force because our presence is so expansive. And again, I think these are themes that have already been mentioned, but we embrace the following 5 core values, which are inclusion. I think every president has mentioned that, leadership, innovation, scholarship, and mentorship. So in order to look inward as a society, we also had to look inward at ourselves as leaders. And so under past President Justin Dimick and current President Caprice Greenberg, we used the competing values framework that was developed at Michigan to really understand the culture of our organization. And I don't think that it would surprise anyone that our leadership in our society is all about innovation, creativity, articulating future vision, and transformational change. I also think it's probably not all that surprising that we're not about structure and control of processes. But keeping that in mind and keeping our mission in mind, in order to really grow our membership and truly be inclusive, we have had to institute measures to ensure that we have adequate finances and operational infrastructure to accomplish all of this. And thus we have developed a strategic plan across the presidents in our decade that will transcend all future presidencies. So having looked inward, we also reached outward. And in doing so, we continued on the efforts of all of the past presidents. So Herb mentioned medical students, and this Redefining Surgery is an initiative that was a partnership between AAS, SUS, APDS, and ACS. And it really meant to provide a compelling story to young, bright students about why they should become surgeons. And I'd just like to mention that this was championed by Peter Nelson, who is a co-chair of the Leadership Committee, as well as a longstanding Executive Council member. And I think we've seen the success of this initiative just in terms of the sheer numbers of medical students who are members of the AAS, who attend the Academic Surgical Congress, and the outstanding presentations that we heard yesterday from our top medical students. However, medical students aren't the only ones that have angst about surgery. We hear from residents as well that they're concerned about maintaining a balance and achieving the so-called triple threat. And this is a quote from one of the residents who wrote to us after attending the AAS fall courses about the struggle to maintain excellence in all facets. So as Dr. Brunicardi mentioned, our decade embraced social media. So in an effort to quell concerns by medical students, residents, and faculty, we started the AAS blog in 2013. And this is now a robust website where there are discussions, tweets, blogs about anything from updates on the society to how to use social media in medical education and how to negotiate your first startup package. So I think as a society of young surgeons, it's not surprising that we've embraced social media, but in fact, technology has been increasing amongst all age sets. So in 2011, 35% of Americans owned a smartphone, and as of 2016, 77% owned one. 1 in 20 people in 2005 used social media, and today 7 in 10 do so. This is a chart of the growth of our Twitter following. So in 2011, we had 197 followers, and as of 2016, we had almost 9,000. And as of 6 o'clock this morning, the tweets at this meeting reached almost 5,000, and the number of impressions was 16.8 million impressions. So I think in addition to reaching out to medical students, residents, we've also increased further our attempts to become more international and globally aware. So in 2010, there was a study called the Global Burden of Diseases, Injuries, and Risk Factors that showed that surgery actually transcends all disease subcategories, and that in fact, current methods of measuring the global burden of disease do not reflect the fundamental role operative intervention plays in the delivery of healthcare services. And acknowledging this, as well as our goal of inclusivity, we were one of 70+ organizations to join the G4 Alliance, which is the Global Alliance for Surgery, Obstetrics, Trauma, and Anesthesia. In addition to building on the past decade's work in starting the West Africa course and joining the G4 Alliance, we also funded our Global Surgery Fellowship in 2013, which is now an annual award, and we incorporated global surgery breakout sessions with the SUS into the Academic Surgical Congress. So we looked inward, we're reaching outward, and in pressing forward to shape the future of academic surgery, we have had to deal with challenges in our decade as well. So in 2010, Obama signed the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, and we can tell that the AAS and the SUS have maintained a currency in terms of the topic at ASC. It's actually been presented twice since 2010, and potentially next year's 2018 hot topic will be the Obamacare replacement plan. We have also seen diminished NIH funding, and in 2013, the AAS and SUS partnered to start the Surgical Investigators course, the grant writing workshop, and this year we actually have had our 5th workshop. We've seen the rise of patient-centered outcomes research. With the signing of the ACA, we had the PCORI. We've seen patient-centered outcomes enter into the abstracts in the ASC, into the fall courses, and into the grant funding workshop. We've also seen that pivotal trials are being presented and led by AAS members, so the flexibility in-duty hour requirements for surgical trainees trial, which deals with a very relevant issue of resident well-being as well as patient safety, was presented last year at the Academic Surgical Congress, and it was led by our AAS Secretary, Carl Villamoria. So as was our motto at the 2014 Executive Council Retreat, the best way to predict your future is to create it. And the way that we're going to create it is by staying true to our core values of inclusion, leadership, innovation, scholarship, and mentorship. But at the very core of our society, it's all about the people and the personal relationships that we make here. So as I have looked inward at what has happened to our society in the past decade and thought about our reach outwards, in pressing forward, I believe our future is very bright. I have 3 additional slides that, before we go to the panel. Sorry. So as I mentioned, the only reason we have seen further is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So as the president of the AAS Foundation, I just want to mention that in honor of the 50th anniversary, we would like to honor past president Dr. Michael Zinner, and the foundation has named our award for trainees that funds clinical research, education, or health services research after him. And we have this award. And it says, "Thank you for your decades of training and mentoring countless leaders of academic surgery, for your leadership in the AAS and the impact you have made on members of the organization and surgery departments across the country." Yes, please.
Well, thank you. I actually did not know this was coming. So thank you all, and it's been a great honor and a privilege to be part of the AAS for a very long time. I will tell you my interest in health services research and global surgery and the things like that really began about 15 years ago. I tell my faculty, I tell all the staff, and some who may have listened yesterday, that we were in the young people business. And so about 15 years ago, I was a traditionally trained translational scientist, if you will, physiology kind of guy. And I began listening to what the residents were talking about and what they wanted. And it was very clear that they were getting disillusioned with going to the bench. They were more interested in quality and global health and issues around health services research. So we started something at the Brigham, the Center for Surgery and Public Health, just to be able to support that. And then about 10 years ago, having been a member of the Surgical Biology Club at the American College of Surgeons Clinical Congress, I turned to Caprice and Selwyn Rogers and Atul Gawande and said, why don't we start the Surgical Outcomes Club? And then basically, my job was to just write the check and rent the ballroom, and then turn it over to Caprice, who's actually grown that and the organization quite well. So I'm deeply honored. I thank you very much. I consider this as one of the more important organizations I've ever been part of, and I've enjoyed all of my time associated with the young people associated with it. Thank you.
Congratulations, Dr. Zinner. I would also like to thank the 5 past presidents for being perfectly on time with their talks, which leaves us time for questions and answers. So is there anyone in the audience that has a question for the 5 past presidents? Dr. Chen, what was one of your favorite memories of being in the AAS?
Well, there are really many, but I would say probably, as Lillian pointed out, it's about the people. All the people that I've met, all the mentors such as you and the people on this table that have helped me, and just the interactions that I see today at the meeting with a lot of people just talking, hanging out, working together to advance both science, surgery, and everything that we're in touch with.
Dr. Polk, what would be one of your favorite memories?
Listen, the best story of this organization nobody knows is we stole the bus in Rochester. There was a miserably cold night. We were in some kind of school bus, and he didn't come for more than an hour. And there were 7 or 8 of us found a way to start the school bus, and we drove it back to the hotel, where it was found safe and sound the next day. Those kind of stories need to be preserved.
Dr. Zinner?
Well, I would say, I would summarize it by saying it was more of the, what I remember the most is the collegiality associated with the organization, going to meetings and enjoying being with your colleagues. And I guess, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but it would have been in the 70s that we had the one and only meeting on Key Biscayne in Florida. And I don't remember anything intellectual about the meeting, but I do remember those drinks with the umbrellas on them. And that was essentially the only thing I remembered from the meeting. And also, going to meetings at universities as opposed to resorts, and like going to Minnesota and freezing my ass off and wondering why in the world would I go to Minnesota in the winter when I was born in Florida. So those are the kinds of memories, but I think the association is the collegiality associated with it.
Dr. Soybel, and if anyone else has any questions, please come up and ask. Dr. Soybel?
Well, I guess in order to describe the best memory I have of the AAS, I'm going to have to name some names. In 1991, when Neil Garrison was the president and the meeting was held in Denver, you're part of this, Chuck. It was really my first opportunity to meet people. I was in New Haven at the time. You were UCLA with Mike. Julie Freischlag was there, and a bunch of other people who, Stan Ashley, Bauer Sumpio. We found ourselves at a bar called the Queen Bee. And since that time, anybody who was there that evening will mention to people applying for residencies in their respective departments, so-and-so has a good voice. And that was a really, it emphasizes what everybody here is describing, which is the collegiality that you form with young people, and you don't know where you don't exactly know where you're going to be in 20 years, but you know you're here right now and you're enjoying everybody's company immensely.
They say if you remember that evening, you weren't there. Just.
Thanks for a wonderful panel. My question for you guys is future. Your phenotypes of academic studies has changed a lot in the last 50 years. What will the president of the AAS look like in 2026? What will the phenotype be? What will they study scientifically? Who will they be?
They better learn something about public health. Yeah, I've learned more in the last 7 months, the only new job I've had in 45 years. Public health is a huge different thing, and we ignore it at our own peril.
So to repeat the question is, what's the phenotype going to look like in 10 years? And, you know, Yogi Berra said, predicting the future is really hard when you talk about what's going to happen. And it's really hard to say that. The only thing I can tell you, Justin, is I know the values will be the same. I can't tell you the content, because the content will change. It'll evolve over time. But I am convinced that the values that have been instilled in this organization from the beginning will remain.
I think the beauty of the AAS is that it's not decided by us what it's going to look like in 20 years, and that we depend on the future generations to decide what that looks like.
I would just add, I think, along the lines of what Dr. Polk and Lillian have said, it's going to be about people who are functioning in groups very, very differently than we did. We grew up as individual achievers. That's how we were rewarded, promoted, et cetera. What's coming next is people who work in groups, crowdsourcing. This meeting is a perfect example of crowdsourcing. And so the leadership of the AAS is going to be a group of people who think globally, crowdsource globally, but act locally.
Dr. Chen?
Oh, why don't you take the question?
Oh, yes, sir. So the question is, what advice do the past presidents have for the residents and junior faculty to keep the momentum going forward?
That's easy. Show up.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think it's so important to come every year. it's a challenge to become a professor of surgery. And when you come to the meeting, as I have done since 1983, you get inspired by those around you and you figure out what they're doing. And there are all these courses and lectures to tell you how to handle it and manage it and learn the techniques to become a professor of surgery. So I agree, showing up at the meeting will inspire you and you will learn a great deal from your colleagues. Yes, okay, Suzanne. Okay, so the question is, what do we say to anyone who has a large educational debt burden and whether they're trying to decide on a career in academic surgery?
Well, one of the things that happens is there are variable funds that go from year to year that provide some payback on indebtedness. The trouble to pay back now on indebtedness is in the $300,000 and $400,000 range. Hitting that 15 or 20 or 30,000 times is going to be really hard. More and more hospitals recruiting surgeons are doing significant paybacks through their foundation. And it may be that some medical schools have to begin to think that way.
Very difficult question to answer. And to be flipped for a second, one, marry well. But having said that, that's not everybody's option. There are opportunities in individual foundations and all that do exactly what Dr. Polk has described.
I tell all the students, do not worry. It's the best investment you'll ever make in your life. That later on they'll go out and buy homes with big mortgages and buy nice cars, and that this investment in their education will be the single best investment they will ever make. It will help thousands of people with the care that they give. It will train the next generation. And then it will also help their own families. So that's how I look at it. Okay, I'd like to thank the panelists for their outstanding lectures. I'd like to thank President Greenberg for the opportunity for the floor, and I'm very excited to hear her presidential address. Thank you, everyone.